Pope Leo XIV had just been elected, but during his papal inauguration, he said one thing about Pope Francis that stunned the world. It wasn't planned, it wasn't political, but it changed how the Church saw both men. What did he say, and why did it? Leave the Vatican speechless? Before we reveal it, press the subscribe button and tell us in the comments below where in the world you're watching from. Now let's get into it. May 8th, 2025. The sun over Rome had broken early that morning, casting St. Peter's Square in a golden stillness, the kind that doesn't move, but waits. Pilgrims had arrived before dawn, draped in flags and rosaries, some pressing their foreheads to the cold stone in silent prayer. The Swiss guards stood, like living statues, their uniforms catching every stray breeze, like banners stitched from history itself. Inside the square, cardinals gathered in neat rows, their scarlet vestments blazing like fire against the white canopy above. And at the center of it all, stepping into a moment carved from centuries, was Robert Francis Prevost, now Pope Leo. Und sees. He moved slowly but with purpose, with a grace that couldn't be choreographed. His cassock was pristine white, but his face still bore the humble weariness of a missionary who'd spent more of his life under tin roofs than cathedral domes. He carried no grandeur on his shoulders, only memory. As the Mass unfolded, Latin prayers rose like incense into the Roman sky. Choirs sang with precision. The cameras broadcast every solemn second to televisions and devices across the globe. America's first pope standing beneath Michelangelo's dome, ready to bless a church still grieving the loss of Francis. The liturgy followed its strict order. Readings, processions, hymns, every step measured, every movement timed, until it wasn't. It happened just before the apostolic blessing, the final moment, the formal seal of the inauguration. The moment that would close the door on one era and open another. Pope Leo XIV stepped forward toward the microphone. The congregation rose as they were supposed to. Bishops adjusted their mitres. Cameramen zoomed in, but instead of lifting his hands for the blessing, Leo reached into his cassock pocket and pulled out something small, a rosary. It wasn't ornamental. No gold, no ivory, just wood, dark, worn, unpolished. The beads looked hand-carved, uneven, a few of them chipped at the edges, like they had been prayed through deserts, not parlors. He held it in one hand, looked down at it for a breath, then raised his eyes to the crowd, not just to those in the square, but to the millions watching. His voice was quiet, not rehearsed, not thunderous. This belonged to the man who never wanted applause, the man who washed feet, not for ceremony, but because they were dirty. He gave me this in silence, and I carry it now, for him. Silence. Not even the wind moved. In the front row, a few cardinals exchanged glances. One bishop blinked slowly, uncertain if what had just been said was authorized or allowed. But the crowd didn't stir, not in confusion but reverence. The kind of stillness that only comes when something honest breaks through the script. Leo didn't explain further. He returned the rosary to his pocket, looked up toward the crucifix, and then, calmly, continued with the apostolic blessing. Voice, steady and strong. It lasted less than 20 seconds, but by that night, it had already circled the globe. Long before he stood on the loggia above St. Peter's Square, long before he was called Your Holiness, or draped in papal white, Robert Francis Prevost was just a boy from Chicago with calloused hands, an old pair of sneakers and a stubborn reverence for quiet things. He was born on September 14th, 1955, on the city's south side, in a working-class neighborhood where the streets echoed with Spanish, English, and Creole, languages that stitched together the immigrant families who lived there. His father worked in electrical maintenance. His mother taught catechism on Wednesdays in the basement of their parish church. The kind of woman who brought sandwiches to funerals and never said a word about it. Faith was not discussed in abstractions. In the Prevost home, it was handed down in gestures, in how you showed up, in how you kept your word, in how you bent your knees in prayer when no one was watching. Robert never aimed for the Vatican. He didn't hunger for degrees or titles. He joined the Order of St. Augustine because he liked the simplicity of their charism. One heart and one soul on the way to God. He liked that it sounded less like a mission and more like a direction. It was in his early 20s, studying in Rome, that he first sensed the church was bigger than rituals. A classmate had said something about evangelization as strategy, and Robert had flinched. He wasn't interested in strategy. He was interested in the woman selling bread outside the basilica who crossed herself every time the bells rang. After his ordination, he asked to be sent somewhere no one else wanted. The reply came in one line: Northern Peru, San Jose de Saramuro. And that's where he disappeared for the next 16 years. No headlines, no titles, no photos. In Peru, he was simply Padre Roberto. He walked miles on foot through jungle and mud, baptized children in rivers, and held mass on wooden planks where the roof leaked in 6 places. He learned Spanish by listening more than speaking, and Quechua by praying with farmers who had lost their livestock but not their hope. He fixed broken pews with borrowed hammers, rode a donkey 4 hours through mountain roads to bring antibiotics to an elderly man with pneumonia, slept under mosquito nets, and shared his own food during floods. When a small school ran out of chalk, he made some from crushed limestone and clay. They didn't call him Monsignor. They called him Family. It was only after a Peruvian bishop mentioned him during a Vatican synod that his name returned to Rome. Francis was listening, quietly, carefully. Years later, in 2023, Pope Francis summoned him back to the Vatican, named him prefect of the dicastery for bishops, and made him a cardinal. The Roman press called him the American outsider. He never responded. But in private, when asked why Francis had brought him to Rome, Robert only said, "He remembered something I thought the world had forgotten." Now, 2 years later, he stood as Pope Leo XIV, not by design, but by witness. It was a Thursday morning in late autumn, the kind of Roman day that began in mist and never quite dried. Inside the Domus Sanctae Marthae, the Pope's residence, most of the staff moved in quiet routines, tea trays, handwritten notes, the faint whir of a printer near the guest wing. But in a corner apartment overlooking the garden path, something rare was happening. Pope Francis had asked to see Cardinal Robert Prevost alone, no advisors, no Swiss guard, no minutes to be taken, just the two of them. Robert arrived exactly on time, wearing a worn black coat and holding a small folder under his arm. He was still getting used to Rome again. Even after months, the city felt like a museum that asked you to smile politely and never touch anything. Francis greeted him at the door, not with words, but with a pat on the shoulder. His eyes were heavier that morning. His cane seemed more burden than tool. They walked together down a narrow corridor and into the Pope's private kitchen, a modest space with chipped ceramic mugs and an old kettle that whistled louder than it boiled. "Sit," Francis said, gesturing to a wooden chair. Robert did. There was no talk of curial appointments, no discussion of diocesan audits or theological controversies. Instead, Francis poured hot water into 2 cups and said, "Have you ever been to Paraguay?" Robert nodded. "Once, during the rains." Francis smiled. "Then you understand what it means to stand in wet shoes for 3 hours without complaining." He reached into the inside pocket of his simple white cassock and pulled out a rosary. It wasn't one of the ceremonial ones, not pearl or silver. The beads were irregular, some lighter, some darker, carved from what looked like fence-post wood. The kind you'd find nailed across farm gates or prison yards. "This was given to me by a woman in the Chaco," Francis said. "She lost her land lost her husband, lost everything but faith. She made this from what the thieves left behind. He turned, the rosary over in his hand, then looked at Robert. "I want you to keep it." Robert hesitated. "Holy Father, I can't accept." Francis cut him off. "I'm not giving it to you. I'm entrusting it." Silence filled the space between them like incense. Robert slowly took the rosary and held it gently in his palm. He didn't kiss it. He didn't weep. He just stared at it, like it held a memory that hadn't been his. Until now. Francis leaned back, his voice quieter now. The church doesn't need another protector. It needs someone who remembers what wounds look like, someone who doesn't mind getting their knees dirty. Robert nodded once. "You know I'm not made for Rome." Francis smiled faintly. "That's why Rome will need you." They sat there for a long time, no agenda, no instructions, just the sound of 2 cups cooling in a small, sunlit kitchen. That was the last time Francis ever mentioned the rosary, but Robert carried it every day after. The Sistine Chapel had seen centuries of conclaves, of whispers, alignments, strategy, disguised as prayer, but never had it seen anything quite like the one in May 2025. From the outside, it looked as expected. Cardinals arriving under marble colonnades, papal tailors standing by, journalists setting up live shots, speaking in urgent tones about frontrunners and factions and geopolitics. They were wrong. Inside, the walls of the Vatican most expected a return to familiarity. A European, perhaps, someone who would balance the tone after Francis, someone safer, more polished, less unpredictable. Cardinal Robert Francis Prevost was not on the betting lists. He didn't fit the mold. He didn't court alliances. He had barely spoken in public since arriving in Rome. But in the quiet hours after Francis's funeral, his name began surfacing, not in headlines, but in hushed tones among bishops from Latin America, Africa, and the Philippines. They remembered the mud on his cassock, the way he had preached without a microphone in flooded parishes, the time he walked 3 days into the jungle to reach a village without a priest. A bishop from Malawi put it plainly. He is not the next. Francis, he is the one who sat beside him when no one else did. As the ballots were cast, one after another, the momentum shifted. On the 4th ballot, the silence in the chapel changed. The guards outside noticed it first, a stillness that wasn't procedural, but personal. Then came the fumata bianca, white smoke. The bells of St. Peter's rang out into the early evening sky. Crowds surged forward. Tourists wept. Reporters scrambled for information. Inside, Cardinal Prevost stood slowly when his name was confirmed. He said very little. "I am only a servant," he murmured. "Let me walk barefoot." He chose the name Leo XIV, a choice that baffled most at first. The last Pope Leo had reigned over a century ago, a theologian, an intellectual, but those who knew Prevost understood. The name was not about legacy, but humility. Leo the Fern had once been called the bridge builder in a time of war. Robert Francis. Prevost didn't want to rebuild the church. He wanted to carry what was nearly lost. Back in Chicago, the phone lines at his childhood parish rang off the hook. A deacon from Chiclayo, Peru, broke down on live radio. "We knew him when he fixed the leaky roof himself," he said. "We never thought Rome would see him." Inside the Swiss Guard barracks, one veteran corporal remembered a quiet moment 2 years earlier, when Francis had walked past Prevost in the Domus garden, stopped and simply said, "He listens." That memory stayed with him, and as Pope Leo XIV stepped onto the balcony that night, the crowds below erupted, not with shock, but with something deeper. Recognition. The camera zoomed in as he lifted his hand for the blessing, and just for a moment, if you looked closely, you could see something inside his left cassock pocket. Not a speech, not a relic, but a rosary, carved from fence posts, worn from prayer. The sun over Rome was sharp that morning, not golden, like it had been the day of his election. Today it was white and hard, reflecting off marble and brass, bathing the square in a light so pure it almost seemed intrusive. Pope Leo XIV stood at the threshold of the basilica, flanked by Swiss guards in full ceremonial trim. His white cassock moved lightly in the wind, the zucchetto on his head, the only splash of colour, barely clinging to his greying hair. The liturgy had begun hours earlier, but now came the final movement, the formal inauguration. Every corner of St. Peter's Square was filled. The bleachers were brimming with clergy, diplomats, press, pilgrims. Flags from every continent rippled. The crowd spanned from stone columns to smartphone screens. You could feel the weight of the moment pressing inward from every direction. The cameras were rolling, the choir began to sing the Te Deum. The new pope moved toward the altar, slowly, his hands folded at the waist. A hush rolled over the square. As the music softened, a final blessing was expected, a papal address rehearsed and vetted, a seal to mark the beginning of a new pontificate. He stepped to the microphone. There was a pause. Not dramatic, but unplanned. Then, instead of opening the leather folio prepared by the Vatican liturgical office, Pope Leo reached into his cassock pocket and pulled out something familiar to some, but known fully only by one man now buried beneath the marble. The wooden rosary, the same one given to him in silence by Pope Francis in a quiet kitchen 2 years earlier. He didn't raise it like a relic. He simply held it, thumb gently pressing one of the worn beads, and then he spoke. His voice was not loud, not poetic, just steady, human. He said to me once, "Don't protect the church, hold it when it cries." That's what I intend to do. That was it. The words carried like incense, rising, weightless, then heavy. You could feel it instantly. Something had broken loose. Some of the cardinals stiffened in their seats. Others looked down. There was no mention of doctrine, no reference to tradition or prophecy, just a sentence, personal, unfiltered, unapproved. But the crowd was still, a stillness that didn't ask for explanation. It was not a political line. It was not rebellion. It was memory. Somewhere near the front, a seminarian quietly began to weep. Far back near the colonnades, a group of Peruvian nuns pressed their rosaries to their lips. Up in the Vatican press box, a seasoned reporter whispered to her colleague, "That wasn't a mistake." She was right. Leo returned the rosary to his pocket. Then with perfect composure he lifted his hands and delivered the apostolic blessing, word for word, as expected. But no one was listening to the formula. They were still hearing the line before it. And somewhere in the crowd, someone murmured what many were now thinking, "That sounded like Francis." That evening, long after the final bell had echoed across the square and the pilgrims began their slow exodus toward buses and boarding passes, a quiet murmur passed through the Vatican's inner walls. Not about politics, not about policy, about the rosary. The object itself had appeared only briefly, clutched in the Pope's hand for a moment, and then tucked away. But to those who had served under Pope Francis, those who had seen it before, its appearance meant everything. It wasn't a ceremonial item, not one of the ornate gifts presented by heads of state. It had no Vatican seal, no encased glass, no explanation, just wood. Dark, uneven, splintered in places. A few of the beads were different shapes entirely, likely replaced over the years. Some showed signs of smoke, others water damage. But it was unmistakable. It had once belonged to Pope Francis, and before that, to a woman no one outside Paraguay would remember. In a side chapel off the basilica, an elderly priest recognized it immediately. His name was Father Rafael Duarte, and he had been stationed in the Chaco region of Paraguay nearly 40 years earlier. When a young Jorge Bergoglio visited on pastoral tour, Raphael had been the one to escort him through flooded farmland, where displaced families had erected makeshift chapels with tarp and torn fence posts. She was barefoot, Father Raphael would later recount, and she was shaking with fever when she placed that rosary in his hands. She told him her land had been taken, her husband jailed, her sons gone, but that the Lord still walked with her. She had carved those beads herself from the broken fence, said prayer was the only thing left. Bergoglio had kept it, not for show, for memory. It traveled with him across decades, from Argentina to Rome. He never displayed it in public, but it was often beside him at night, clutched during hospital visits, or visible on his bedside table during those late-night domus vigils when the pain in his knees wouldn't let him sleep. And now, somehow, it had passed into the hands of Pope Leo. No official statement explained how. There was no documentation, no record in the apostolic archive, but those who served closest to Francis always suspected he had quietly entrusted certain things, not to the institution but to individuals, people who would know how to carry them without turning them into symbols. That night, in a staff residence behind the Vatican pharmacy, a young sacristan named Matteo watched the recorded footage again on his tablet. He froze the moment where the beads caught the light. He enlarged the frame. There it was. He whispered the only thing he could think to say. He gave it to the one who wouldn't frame it. By morning, the photo had already circled WhatsApp groups among clergy and Vatican staff. No one commented officially, but among those who knew, those who had seen the rosary on Francis' bedside or remembered it from a distant trip to Paraguay, there was only one conclusion. It wasn't a gesture. It was an inheritance. Officially, there was no response, no press release, no clarification, no correction. The Vatican bulletin issued only a brief summary the following morning. The Holy Father delivered the apostolic blessing at the conclusion of the inauguration Mass. Approximately 250,000 were in attendance. But behind the alabaster walls and frescoed corridors of the Apostolic Palace, the silence wasn't empty. It was electric. In one corner of the Curia, there was admiration. Cardinals from Latin America, Africa, Southeast Asia, those who had served. Among the poor who had walked through slums, who had buried children with their bare hands, understood exactly what had happened. It wasn't rebellion, one archbishop from Nairobi told his aide. It was reverence, but others weren't so sure. In the afternoon session of the Dicastery for Divine Worship, a prominent Italian cardinal reportedly muttered, "This was not a moment for improvisation." Another called it a gesture too raw for ceremony, and a third, an aging canon lawyer, warned that emotion must never interrupt tradition. Still, no one dared speak against Pope Leo XIV publicly. Not yet, but the tension was real. At the press office, reporters pressed for clarification. Was the rosary significant? Had Francis given it to him personally? Why the deviation from script? Director Matteo Rosselli gave the same answer to every inquiry. The Pope speaks from the heart. We will not comment on gestures meant for the soul. Even inside the Congregation for Bishops, where Leo had worked just 2 years earlier, there were long pauses between coffee sips that used to be filled with confident gossip. Now everything felt uncertain, not hostile, just unprepared. He won't be easy to control, one Monsignor whispered, but maybe that's the point. In the press, headlines danced around the event. The Pope's rosary, symbol or signal. Leo XIV's inauguration breaks tradition or enriches it. From Chicago to Rome, the missionary Pope speaks in silence, but outside the Vatican, the response was simpler, kinder, deeper. In Chiclayo, Peru, where Prevost had once served, thousands gathered outside the cathedral for a candlelit vigil. No one had organized it. The candles just came, the prayers just began. One local woman who had known him as Padre Roberto held a photo of him lifting sandbags during a flood. She whispered to a nearby reporter, "He never needed to be Pope, but he always carried something holy." In the Bronx, a parish priest held a rosary-making workshop for local youth. When asked why, he smiled and said, "Because sometimes the holiest things are made from what's left behind." And in Rome, inside a modest nun's residence near Campo de' Fiori, an elderly sister wrote a letter by hand. She had once cared for Francis during a recovery stay, had seen the rosary on his bedside, had dusted it carefully, never daring to move it. She addressed the envelope simply, "To the Holy Father." No response needed, only prayers. She ended with one line, "I saw it once beside him when he wept. I'm glad it's in hands that understand." The square was empty now. It was well past midnight, and the last pilgrims had drifted away, leaving behind a scattering of crumpled service booklets and melted wax puddled on the cobblestones. The lights that usually bathed St. Peter's in golden warmth had been dimmed, leaving the basilica half silhouetted against the black Roman sky, but one figure remained. Pope Leo XIV walked alone, no entourage, no Swiss guard, no driver idling nearby, just the sound of his footsteps echoing faintly off centuries of stone. He moved slowly, deliberately, through the side entrance of the basilica, one he had used countless times before, when he was still. Cardinal Prevost, the guard on night watch, recognized him but didn't speak, only nodded. The Pope nodded back. Inside, the basilica felt cavernous in its stillness. The air was cool, holy. He didn't pause at the high altar. He didn't look up at the dome or the saints above. He walked past all of them, straight toward the grotto level, where the tombs of the popes rest in quiet dignity, away from the cameras and ceremony. He stopped at one in particular, the simple stone slab inscribed only with Franciscus Pontifex Maximus 1936, 2025, no embellishment, just the name. There was no guard here, no incense, no music, only memory. Leo reached into his cassock pocket and pulled out the rosary, the one carved from broken fence posts, the one Francis had once pressed into his hand across a table with chipped mugs and cooling mate. He knelt. There were no words, only breath. For several minutes he remained still, his head bowed, one hand resting gently on the cold marble, the other clutching the rosary like it was the last fragile thread between two chapters of the same soul. Then slowly he stood. He placed the rosary gently on the tomb, resting it at the edge where Francis's name was carved. It sat there silently, not as an offering, but as a promise. But just as he turned to leave, he hesitated. He reached back down and took the rosary again, not out of reluctance, out of resolve. A soft whisper escaped his lips, barely audible in the silence. "I'll give it back when the Church no longer needs it." Then he turned, walked the length of the basilica, and stepped into the Roman night. The door closed behind him with a muted click. The next morning, the sacristan who arrived early to clean found a single white candle, unlit, placed carefully near the base of the tomb. No note, no explanation. But the wax bore the imprint of a hand, and when he bent to pick it up, he noticed a single splintered bead on the ground, missed perhaps from the rosary's long journey. He left it there. Some things, he thought, were meant to remain behind. If someone handed you Pope Francis' rosary, worn, handmade, passed in silence, what would you do with it? Would you display it? Or carry it quietly, the way Pope Leo XIV did? Let us know in the comments. We read every single one. And if this story gave you a different way to think about legacy, about quiet strength, or about what the Church truly needs now, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you never miss one of our daily stories. And if you know someone who still thinks power is what makes a pope, share this video with them, not to argue, but to show them Sometimes leadership is what's held in your pocket, not what's worn on your shoulders. Our other stories should be appearing on your screen now. Tap 1 to keep watching, and we'll see you tomorrow, same time, with another story inspired by the legacy of Pope Francis.